In 2003, the scholar Joy James gathered the writings of more than 20 incarcerated American thinkers into a single volume she called Imprisoned Intellectuals. Its subtitle named its purpose, America's Political Prisoners Write on Life, Liberation, and Rebellion. The book collects essays, letters, and manifestos written from behind prison walls by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Angela Davis, George Jackson, and Mumia Abu-Jamal. James did not present them as flawless icons, but as voices in a long argument about justice, citizenship, and the meaning of freedom. This documentary walks through that anthology and the tradition it preserves, the long history of women and men who, confined by the state, kept thinking, kept writing, and asked their country hard questions about itself. James builds her book on an idea drawn from the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci, who wrote his own prison notebooks while jailed under Mussolini. Every social group, Gramsci argued, produces its own thinkers who give it awareness of its function and aspirations. By that measure, James writes, the celebrated public intellectual has an often forgotten counterpart, the prison intellectual. The imprisoned writer reflects, like any scholar, on history, ethics, and justice, only from inside a place the state did not authorize for thought. Her anthology asks readers to take that work seriously rather than dismiss it. She is careful to set limits. Victimhood alone does not make a political prisoner, and she refuses to romanticize those who prey on the vulnerable. The figures she gathers are defined, she argues, by political agency in pursuit of a wider democracy. James opens her introduction with two epigraphs that set its moral key. From Henry David Thoreau, she takes the line that under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just person is also a prison. From Mohandas Gandhi, she takes the teaching that it is the action, not its fruit, that matters. One must do the right thing even if no result ever comes. Together, these frame her title, American Prison Notebooks, a deliberate echo of Gramsci. She argues that the public intellectual we celebrate, the recognized writer and pundit, has a quieter twin in the prison intellectual, who reflects on the same questions of justice and meaning from a place society never meant for thought. When the imprisoned give voice to those denied full democratic power, she writes, our stories of war and love take on a new and often disturbing life. Before introducing the writers, James confronts a question that has divided activists and scholars for decades. In the United States, who actually counts as a political prisoner? James opens by refusing easy definitions. She rejects the idea that anyone who simply calls themselves a political prisoner qualifies, or that the label fits anyone the state brands a criminal. If everyone is a political prisoner, she writes, then no one is. Instead, she points to the attorneys Michael Deutsch and Jan Sussler, who described three recognized categories: foreign nationals jailed for acts against the United States allies, members of oppressed communities imprisoned for activities tied to their liberation movements, including combatants entitled under the Geneva Convention to prisoner of war status, and others who acted in solidarity with those movements. What sets these prisoners apart, James argues, is not victimhood, but agency and moral commitment, for which the state often answered with the harshest available sentences. James places the anthology inside a long American history of confining those the country has racially and politically targeted. She notes four threads that run through it. First, she argues, criminality has often been assigned to whole communities by appearance rather than conduct. Second, the memory of slave insurrections and maroon settlements left a tradition of resistance that later movements inherited. Third, 20th century anti-colonial struggles abroad shaped activists at home. Gandhi's example reached Martin Luther King, while the Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba influenced Malcolm X. Fourth, she stresses that radical organizations won mass support less through armed rhetoric than through free breakfast programs, clinics, and schools. It was this popular appeal, she contends, that the government most feared, and that helped drive the surveillance campaigns of the era. James frames her collection as documentary history, manifesto, and theoretical treatise all at once, and she gives it a deliberate shape. The anthology opens, before its first section, with the anarchist Emma Goldman's New Declaration of Independence from 1909, a rewriting of the nation's founding language as a call for liberty without domination. It then chronicles the liberation struggles of the 20th century, beginning and ending, James notes, with spiritual figures, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the Lakota artist Leonard Peltier. Between them stand revolutionaries and pacifists, the famous and the forgotten. James organizes the writers into two broad groupings: Black liberationists first, then internationalists and anti-imperialists, while insisting that the importance of each struggle is framed, not reduced, by the racial dynamics of repression. Before the modern movement, James sets a prologue from an earlier age of American radicalism, a rewriting of the nation's founding promise into a call for universal freedom. Before the writers of the modern movement, James places a prologue from the anarchist Emma Goldman, written in 1909. Goldman, who had immigrated from Russia and served time in an American prison for her organizing, rewrites the Declaration of Independence as a charter against domination of every kind. She holds these truths to be self-evident, she writes, that all human beings, regardless of race, color, or sex, are born with an equal right to share at the table of life. James sets this text at the threshold of her book as a counterweight to any notion of patriotism as unquestioning obedience. Goldman, later deported for her radicalism, stands as an early ancestor of the tradition the anthology traces, a thinker who used the nation's own founding language to indict its failures and to imagine a freedom broader than the one the state was prepared to grant. The anthology's first and largest section gathers the voices of the Black freedom struggle, beginning with its most famous prisoner and moving towards its most controversial. The section opens with Martin Luther King Jr. and the open letter he wrote in 1963 from a cell in Birmingham, Alabama. Arrested for leading nonviolent demonstrations, King answered white clergymen who had called his protests unwise and untimely. "Justice too long delayed," he replied, "is justice denied, and there comes a time when people grow tired of being pushed out of the sunlight of opportunity." He distinguished just laws from unjust ones and defended the moral duty to disobey the latter openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. Written in the margins of a newspaper and on scraps smuggled from the jail, the letter became one of the central texts of the civil rights movement. James includes it, she notes, as the missive of a formally trained clergyman whose risk-taking carried broad moral authority. Against King, James sets his symbolic counterpart, Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, and known late in life as Malik el-Shabazz. Imprisoned in the 1940s for burglary, he educated himself behind bars and emerged transformed, first through the Nation of Islam, and later through his pilgrimage to Mecca. The anthology includes an abridged version of his 1964 address, The Ballot or the Bullet, in which he urged Black Americans to understand their struggle as a question of human rights to be carried before the world, and to exercise the vote with full awareness of its power. James is precise about his status. Malcolm was not a political prisoner in her strict sense, but a man jailed for social crimes who reinvented himself as a political agent while incarcerated, and whose example would inspire a generation of activists. In 1966, a year after Malcolm X's assassination, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California. Its 10-point platform demanded employment, housing, education, and an end to police brutality, and the party became, James writes, the most confrontational of the era's radical groups. The anthology includes Newton's essay, Prison, Where is Thy Victory?,
in which he distinguishes between kinds of prisoners, reserving his deepest respect for those who resist rather than submit to domination. Newton coined the phrase revolutionary suicide to describe a willingness to risk everything for liberation. Yet James reminds readers that the party's widest appeal came from its survival programs, its free breakfasts and clinics, which offered communities a tangible alternative to a state many experienced as hostile.
Among the best-known contributors is Angela Davis, a philosopher and communist who worked alongside the Panthers and helped lead the Soledad Brothers Defense Committee. In 1970, she was charged in connection with an armed attempt to free prisoners from a California courthouse, weapons in the case having been registered in her name. She spent months in jail before a jury acquitted her of all charges in 1972. From her cell, she wrote the essay reprinted here, Political Prisoners, Prisons, and Black Liberation, which first appeared in the volume she co-edited, If They Come in the Morning. In it, Davis argued that the prison had become a central institution of racial control, and that the political prisoner exposes, in concentrated form, the injustices woven through the wider legal order. She would go on to become one of the country's leading scholars of incarceration.
George Jackson entered prison at 18 for a service station robbery, and through years of confinement became one of its most influential writers and theorists. A field marshal of the Black Panther Party and co-founder of the Soledad Brothers Defense Committee, he documented prison life in best-selling letters and described himself as a militarist for liberation. The anthology includes his essay, Towards the United Front, in which he called for a broad, multiracial movement that would transcend the divisions the system relied upon. Jackson was killed by guards at San Quentin in 1971 in an incident the prison called an escape attempt, and his supporters disputed. James presents his work honestly as both a powerful analysis of confinement and a contested legacy, the writing of a man who became, in her phrase, a revolutionary strategist turned icon.
No event looms larger over the anthology than the Attica prison uprising of September 1971, which followed soon after George Jackson's death. Inmates at the New York prison seized control of a cell block and held it for several days, issuing a manifesto that demanded safe and sanitary conditions, decent food, medical care, and fair wages for their labor. James reads the rebellion as a moment of collective political agency, prisoners organizing to be recognized as human beings. When Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered the National Guard and state police to retake the prison by force, dozens of prisoners and hostages were killed in the assault. Attica became a national symbol of the stakes of prison reform and a reference point for nearly every writer in this collection, evidence in James's account of how the demand for dignity behind bars was met. Several contributors write from inside a history the government itself later disavowed, a covert campaign to surveil, disrupt, and destroy the movements of the era. A former Black Panther leader in New York, Dhoruba bin Wahad spent 19 years in prison before his conviction was overturned in 1990, after files revealed that evidence favorable to his defense had been concealed. His essay examines COINTELPRO, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's counterintelligence program, which a 1975 Senate committee, chaired by Frank Church, investigated and condemned. The program, the committee found, had used infiltration, forged letters, and worse, to disrupt civil rights and Black Power organizations and to discredit their leaders. James cites this history to make a careful point. The heaviest sentences were sometimes imposed on people later shown to be innocent of the specific charges against them. The multi-million-dollar settlements the government eventually paid in cases like bin Wahad's, she notes, stand as a measure of that wrong. As COINTELPRO fractured the Panthers, some members moved underground into what became known as the Black Liberation Army. Jalil Abdul Muntakim, imprisoned for decades, contributes an essay reflecting on that organization and the conditions that produced it.
The anthology also includes the writing of Assata Shakur, convicted in connection with a 1973 New Jersey Turnpike shootout that left a state trooper and an activist dead. Shakur escaped from prison in 1979 and received political asylum in Cuba, where she has remained, becoming one of the most debated figures of the period. James presents these writers as participants in a history of repression and counter-resistance, documenting how the surveillance campaigns of the era pushed parts of a once public movement into clandestine struggle and what that turn cost the people drawn into it.
Two further voices in this section trace long lives given to the movement. Safia Bukhari Alston, who came to activism through the Panther's free breakfast programs, recounts in Coming of Age, a Black Revolutionary, how a young woman was radicalized by what she witnessed and went on to organize for political prisoners until her death. Sundiata Akoli, a mathematician and former Panther convicted alongside Assata Shakur, contributes an updated history of what he calls the new African prison struggle, written from decades of confinement. James includes such autobiographical essays to show that these were not abstract militants, but people shaped by specific encounters with poverty, policing, and community organizing, who understood their imprisonment as a continuation, by other means, of the work they had begun in the free world.
The section also reaches beyond the dominant currents of the movement. Lorenzo Comboa Irvin, a former civil rights activist and Black Power activist, contributes an abridged version of his work, Anarchism and the Black Revolution. Drawing on his own years in prison, Irvin argues for a politics rooted in community self-organization and deep skepticism of centralized power, whether held by the state or by a revolutionary party. James values such contributions for the range they reveal. The prisoners in her book did not share a single ideology. Despite common ground in opposing racism and empire, she stresses, they differed in identity, strategy, and belief. There was no monolithic radical prisoner. By placing an anarchist tradition beside Marxist and nationalist ones, the anthology preserves the genuine arguments that ran through the movement, rather than flattening them.
Closing the Black Liberationist section is Mumia Abu-Jamal, a former Panther and radio journalist whose 1982 conviction for the killing of a Philadelphia police officer has been among the most disputed capital cases in the country. From death row, where he spent nearly 3 decades before his sentence was reduced to life, Abu-Jamal became a prolific writer and commentator, the author of many books and broadcasts. His essay here, Intellectuals and the Gallows, reflects on the long tradition of thinkers condemned by the states they challenged. James notes in her acknowledgments that Abu-Jamal offered editorial guidance on earlier drafts of the anthology itself. His presence underscores the book's central claim that serious intellectual work continues to be produced inside prisons, even under sentence of death, by people the wider culture is trained to ignore.
The anthology's second section widens the lens to those who acted in solidarity with liberation movements, white anti-imperialists, Puerto Rican Independentistas, and Native American resistors.
The second section opens with a collective document associated with Mutulu Shakur and a group of fellow prisoners, framed as a petition charging the United States penal system with genocide against Black people. Drawing on the language of the United Nations Genocide Convention, the writers argue that mass incarceration, disproportionate sentencing, and conditions of confinement amount to a deliberate harm against a people. James presents the petition not as a settled verdict, but as a serious attempt by imprisoned thinkers to bring international human rights law to bear on domestic realities. It exemplifies a recurring move in the anthology, appealing past the national courts that convicted them to a wider world of treaties, conventions, and moral standards, asking to be judged by something larger than the system that holds them. A cluster of contributors are white Americans who join the liberation movements of others. Marilyn Buck, a poet imprisoned for her work with militant sectors of the Black liberation movement, contributes an essay on the struggle for status under international law, and her poetry closes the entire book. Rita Boo Brown writes on white North American political prisoners, and an interview gathers the voices of Linda Evans, Susan Rosenberg, and Laura Whitehorn, lesbian activists imprisoned for anti-imperialist actions. James gives these figures careful attention because they complicate any simple racial reading of the period. They chose, at great personal cost, to act in solidarity across the color line, and several, James notes, were held incommunicado after September 11, 2001, when the climate of a new war on terror was used to tighten old forms of repression.
Another current in this section is religious pacifism. Daniel Berrigan, a Jesuit priest and poet, jailed for burning draft files in protest of the Vietnam War, contributes his Letter to the Weatherman, a thoughtful appeal urging fellow radicals toward conscience and away from violence. Michelle Nar Obed writes of the Plowshares movement, in which activists symbolically beat weapons into farm tools and accepted imprisonment as the price of their witness. James includes these voices to honor the breadth of the tradition. Not every prisoner in her book favored armed struggle. Many were pacifists acting from deep religious conviction, willing to suffer the penalty of the law to dramatize their dissent. Their presence, beside the militants, keeps the anthology faithful to the real diversity of strategy and morality among those America has imprisoned for conscience. The anthology gives sustained voice to the Puerto Rican independence movement, whose activists have long been among the country's longest-held political prisoners. Elizem Escobar, a painter imprisoned for his Independentista activity, contributes Art of Liberation, a meditation on creativity as a practice of freedom that no cell can fully contain. Jose Solis Jordan writes a defiant statement under the title, "This is Enough." James notes that some of these prisoners were released by President Bill Clinton on his last day in office after years of advocacy. By including their writing, the anthology insists that the question of Puerto Rico's colonial status remains a living political matter, and that those imprisoned for raising it belong within the same tradition of dissent as the better-known figures of the Black freedom struggle. Among the Native American contributors is Standing Deer, a Lakota activist who, like Malcolm X and George Jackson, entered prison for social crimes and was politicized within it. He became known for refusing to take part in an alleged plot against Leonard Peltier, choosing instead to warn and protect a fellow prisoner at great personal risk. His essay, Violence and the State, reflects on how the apparatus of confinement itself manufactures and channels violence. James includes him as an example of a recurring pattern: people imprisoned for ordinary offenses who, behind bars, develop searching political critiques and remake themselves as conscious actors. Standing Deer's turn from convict to writer and protector embodies the transformation the anthology repeatedly documents, in which the penal site becomes, against every intention, a school of political thought. The anthology closes its arc with Leonard Peltier, the Lakota and Anishinaabe activist of the American Indian movement, convicted in connection with a 1975 shootout at the Pine Ridge Reservation, in which 2 FBI agents were killed. Peltier maintained his innocence across more than 4 decades of imprisonment, and his case drew appeals for clemency from human rights advocates around the world. His contribution, Inapi, Sweat Lodge, turns to the spiritual practice that sustained him, grounding his endurance in tradition and ceremony. James deliberately ends the body of her collection, as she began it, with a spiritual figure, framing the whole tradition of imprisoned thought as one that draws not only on political theory, but on faith, ritual, and the deep cultural resources of besieged communities. Having walked through the writers, James steps back to ask what it means to read them and why this tradition matters beyond the prison walls.
James is wary of a comfortable way of reading prison writing, in which the suffering of the writer becomes a kind of entertainment for the reader. She quotes the scholar Barbara Harlow, who warned that engaging with resistance literature must demand an active response rather than mere aesthetic pleasure. The point of the anthology, James writes, was to foster or force an encounter between those in the so-called free world seeking their own freedoms and those in captivity seeking liberation. She refuses to position imprisoned intellectuals as icons to be admired from a safe distance. Instead, she presents their work as gateways, openings into difficult questions about justice and citizenship that a reader is meant to carry forward, not simply consume and set down. One of the anthology's most distinctive choices is its honesty about the limits of its own subjects. James does not ask readers to agree with everything in the book, or to treat its authors as saints. Engaging with their works, she writes, means reckoning with both their contributions and their contradictions. Some of the writers disagree sharply with one another over the most basic questions: nonviolence or armed struggle, loyal reform or revolution. James lets those disagreements stand on the page. She also acknowledges that the role of an icon can be used to shield a movement from honest criticism, and she resists that temptation. The result is a collection that takes its subjects seriously enough to argue with them, treating them as thinkers rather than relics, which is, in her view, the deepest form of respect.
James grounds the anthology in a body of theory about who belongs to civil society and who is held outside it. She cites the philosopher Michael Hames Garcia, who asks to what kind of public an imprisoned thinker can even speak, and the theorist Frank Wilderson, who, drawing on Frantz Fanon, argues that for Black Americans, civil society itself, not merely its abuses, can feel like a state of emergency. These thinkers help James pose her sharpest questions. How does one make the disappeared reappear, and when is a democracy not a democracy? Rather than resolve them, she lets them frame the reading that follows. The prisoners in her book, she suggests, write from the far side of a line that decides whose humanity is assumed and whose is endlessly put in question.
Many readers of the anthology, James anticipates, will identify to some degree as abolitionists, critics of what is often called the prison industrial complex. She distinguishes a reformist wing, which targets the death penalty, abusive conditions, and racial bias in sentencing, from a more radical current that treats those wrongs as symptoms of a deeper disease. She recalls a sobering history. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery while permitting involuntary servitude as punishment for crime, opening the door to convict leasing, which bound newly freed people back into forced labor for generations. That memory, James argues, shadows every debate in her book. It raises the question of whether confinement in America has ever been only about crime, or whether it has also served as an instrument for managing the very communities her writers came from. Because some of the writers defended armed struggle, James draws careful distinctions that the documentary preserves rather than endorses. Neither crime nor violence, she writes, is inherently revolutionary. Capitalism itself, she observes, was built in the Americas on conquest and forced labor. She separates revolutionaries who seek to build new and lasting institutions from those who merely rebel, and she condemns outright any politics that target civilians. Her project is to understand the historical conditions that pushed some activists from protest toward confrontation, and to ask what that escalation cost them and their communities. The aim throughout is contextual understanding of a difficult history, not advocacy. The anthology describes how these arguments were made and leaves the moral weighing to a thoughtful reader. Finally, the documentary turns to the scholar who assembled these voices and to why the book she made has outlasted its moment. The book bears the imprint of its editor, the political philosopher Joy James, a scholar of Black political thought, feminism, and incarceration, who has taught at several American universities. The anthology grew, she explains, out of a challenge from incarcerated readers who criticized an earlier academic volume for omitting the voices of prisoners themselves. In response, she spent years gathering essays, letters, and manifestos, working with students, attorneys, and the prisoners and their advocates. Royalties from the book, she directed, were reserved for educational work on human rights and incarceration. James writes from a double vantage, she says, as both academic and radical, and she is candid that the collection raises more questions than it can answer. That openness, rather than any single thesis, is what gives Imprisoned Intellectuals its enduring force. More than 20 years after its publication, Imprisoned Intellectuals remains a landmark gathering of a tradition the wider culture is often trained to overlook. The United States holds more people behind bars than any nation on earth, and the questions the anthology raises about who is criminalized, about dissent and democracy, about the meaning of freedom have only grown more urgent. The book's lasting achievement, in James's framing, is to insist that prisons have always been sites of thought as well as punishment, and that the women and men confined within them have produced ideas worth engaging. It belongs beside the older tradition of American prison writing, from Henry David Thoreau to Eugene Debs, as a record of a country still arguing through its most confined citizens about what justice requires. We have walked through Joy James's anthology of America's imprisoned intellectuals, from the Birmingham Jail to the prison yard, from the Black Panther survival programs to the Attica Rebellion, through COINTELPRO, the Underground, the white anti-imperialists, the Puerto Rican Independentistas, and Leonard Peltier's Sweat Lodge. James gathered these voices not as icons to be worshipped, but as thinkers to be reckoned with, in all their conviction and contradiction, and asked her readers to take seriously the idea that serious thought continues behind prison walls. If this history moved you to look closer and to question what you thought you knew, share it, subscribe, and like so more of these voices reach the light. Until next time, keep studying the record with care and seeking the grain of truth held within it.